know that I'm supposed to be talking because this is in fact a talk, but I'm going to start out by leaving you in a bit of an awkward silence. I want you to take a look at this photo and decide what you're looking at. For those of you who have been following the news recently, you've undoubtedly seen many photos like this. Massive amounts of refugees fleeing their countries, risking their lives, searching for safety, and crossing borders, sometimes facing human rights abuses along the way. They travel on whatever means they can, on dangerous routes, losing family members along the way, and trying to find safety wherever they can. However, in some cases, the countries they flee to feel less safe than the country they fled from. The first photo I showed you, like this photo, are those of discarded life vests on the Greek island of Lesbos. Lesbos is a place that is less than half the size of Rhode Island and has received more than 500,000 refugees and migrants in 2015 alone. When the news often talks about refugees, they talk about the numbers. This image shows that the number of people displaced by war has almost doubled in the last 10 years. And while the numbers are useful to get the big picture, what is often lost is the small picture. Faces behind the numbers, like that of Musi, a 17-year-old Eritrean refugee who fled by himself and ended up in Europe. Eritrea is one of the most repressive countries in the world, and yet many people have never even heard of it. Or there's people like Fatima, a young Syrian refugee girl who I met when I was living on the border of Syria and Lebanon. She fled her town of Aleppo when it was bombed, and after her father was arrested by the government. She's with her two younger siblings, and she's never seen her father since. Or there are refugees like that of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a Congolese refugee who was shot directly in the chest when he refused to join with rebel soldiers. They left him for dead, but he survived and made it to Uganda. Then there's refugees like Mohammed, whose neighborhood was infiltrated by ISIS in Syria, and who told me there was no way I could live there anymore. I was terrified. But then again, I don't feel very safe here either. And finally, there's refugees like Jackson. Jackson was a former teacher who fled the DRC in the early 90s. He's been living in a refugee camp for almost 30 years, and he told me, I put on my hat and suit every day, hoping that today's the day I get to go home. So while the news has started to take an interest in refugees, it's been really amazing to see. And although there's some places that are still underreported, like places like Eritrea and refugees from there, it has been an interesting thing to see the news finally take notice of this. But oftentimes they confuse things. So a refugee has to be, if you are a refugee, you have to be outside of your country of origin. Number two, you have to fear persecution for one of these reasons. And number three, your country is unable or unwilling to protect you. So from the news, you might think that Europe is being overrun by refugees, or even from the images I showed you of Greece, it might seem that way. However, the most amount of refugees are in places outside of Europe, places like Kenya, shown in the top left, which has the largest refugee camp in the world and where I lived for more than 2 years. Or, like the bottom right shows, Lebanon, where 1 in 4 people living there are Syrian refugees. So what do we do about it? Resettlement is one of the ways we can help the situation. Resettlement is the act of picking certain refugees that are most vulnerable and bringing them to safer countries. And the US has a long history of this, but as you can see, the graph goes down because generally the trend has gone down. So what does resettlement look like? It looks like my friend Peace, who I met in Kenya and was able to work on the resettlement case of her and her family. She's now a US citizen and college graduate. So while the US has been a leader in resettlement, we can do more. We can fight the stereotypes, and we can recognize that while we might be far away from most wars, we're not absolved from responsibility to them. We're not absolved from the responsibility to help refugees and to be welcoming. And while most refugees, while there's about 60 million displaced people from war, think about the 60 million people like Fatima and Musi and all these people I talked about. One of the main reasons why the number is so high is because of Syria. And I had the opportunity to go to Syria a couple months before the war broke out, a place that George W. had categorized as an extension of the axis of evil. But what I found there was one of the most welcoming places I've ever gone to. So, while you're reading the news, while you're thinking about these large numbers, and while you're reading about massive numbers abroad, think about the refugees that you can help here, and think about prioritizing a focus on what they can bring to us rather than the problems.